My name is Jenna Merrick, and according to my father, I'm the living proof that potential means nothing without follow-through. For the last 8 years, I've been the one they don't talk about unless someone asks directly, and even then, the explanation comes with a sigh and a change of subject. At every holiday, every birthday, every uncomfortable phone call, I've been the daughter who couldn't quite get it together. The one who had promised once but let it slip through her fingers like water. My brother Kyle tells people I'm figuring things out. My sister Bridget just says I'm between opportunities, which is her polite way of saying unemployed. And my father, well, he stopped introducing me as his daughter years ago. Now I'm just Jenna if he bothers to mention me at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What none of them knew, what none of them ever thought to ask, was that I hadn't disappeared because I failed. I disappeared because I was asked to. Because while they were measuring success in corner offices and vacation homes, I was measuring it in lives protected and disasters prevented. Because the work I was doing couldn't exist in the light. And the price of that darkness was letting everyone I loved believe I'd thrown my life away. That afternoon at the 35th annual Merrick Family Reunion, under the late August sun in Cedar Springs, my father stood in front of 40 relatives and said the words I'd heard in different variations for years. Jenna's here, which is surprising since she usually can't commit to anything. Biggest disappointment of my life if I'm being honest. The table went quiet. A few awkward laughs. My mother touched his arm like she wanted him to stop but didn't have the courage to say it out loud. My brother looked at his phone. And I stood there by the drink table, paper cup of lemonade in my hand, ready to leave the way I always did, quietly and without fuss. Then the black SUVs pulled into the gravel parking lot. 3 of them, windows tinted, moving in formation. The kind of vehicles that don't just show up at family barbecues in towns with populations under 10,000. Everyone turned. My Uncle Frank made some joke about the FBI finally catching up to Cousin Terry's tax situation. People laughed nervously. And then the doors opened. Governor Rachel Thornton stepped out, flanked by 2 state troopers and a woman I recognized immediately as her chief of staff. She was in a navy suit despite the heat, her posture sharp and deliberate, the kind of presence that made even the trees seem to stand straighter. She walked across the grass, past the folding tables covered in potato salad and deviled eggs, past my cousins holding solo cups, past the banner that said Merrick Strong since 1989, and she stopped 3 feet from me. My father's face went pale. The governor smiled, extended her hand, and said in a voice everyone could hear, "Miss Merrick, thank you for making time. I know your schedule doesn't allow for much of this." My mother dropped her fork. I shook the governor's hand, calm, steady, the way I'd been trained to do in rooms far more intimidating than this. "Of course, Governor. Shall we talk inside?" She nodded, and together we walked toward the pavilion's back room, leaving my entire family frozen in place like someone had hit pause on their lives. They didn't always look at me like I was broken. When I was 24 and got hired by the Washington State Environmental Agency, my father threw a party. He grilled steaks, bought a case of beer, and told everyone at the hardware store that his daughter was going to be working for the government. Not just any job, he'd say, a real career with benefits and a pension. My mother printed out my offer letter and framed it. She hung it in the hallway next to Kyle's law school diploma and Bridget's wedding photo. For a little while, I was part of the narrative they liked to tell. The Merrick kids are all doing well. Kyle's at a firm in Seattle. Bridget married a developer. And Jenna, she's with the state environmental protection. Important work. I sent postcards from Seattle when I was there for training. Wrote about the mountains and the coffee and how much I was learning. I called home every Sunday and kept it light. Yes, the work's challenging. No, I'm not dating anyone. Yes, I'm eating enough. Tell Bridget congratulations on the new house. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And then I stopped calling. Not all at once. It was gradual, the way most disappearances are. First it was every other week. Then once a month. Then only on birthdays and holidays, and even those calls got shorter. My answers got vaguer. I'm working on a big project. I've been traveling a lot for the agency. I'm staying busy. They didn't push. They never asked what the project was or where I was traveling or why I sounded tired every time we spoke. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe it was easier to assume I was fine, or at least fine enough not to worry about. But the truth was, something had happened in my 8th year with the agency. Something that didn't make the news in the way people think news gets made. There was no press conference, no official statement, just a quiet headline buried on page 6 of the Seattle Times. Environmental officer leaves position following contamination controversy. No name, no photo, but in Cedar Springs, a town where everyone knew everyone, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. My father got a call from an old friend who worked in state administration. I don't know exactly what was said, but after that call, everything changed. He looked at me differently, like I'd taken something precious and thrown it in the garbage. Thanksgiving that year, he didn't ask me about work. He asked Kyle about a case he was working on and asked Marcus about a property development deal. When I offered to help in the kitchen, my mother told me she had it covered. At Christmas, Bridget made a comment about how nice it must be to have so much free time now that I wasn't tied down to a real job. Everyone laughed. I smiled. The kind of smile you learn when your face has to lie for you. What they didn't know, what I couldn't tell them, was that I hadn't left my position because I'd failed. I'd left because I'd been pulled into something bigger, something that required me to stop existing in the way they understood existence. The contamination controversy was real. An industrial site outside Tacoma had been leaking chemical runoff into a tributary that fed into the Puyallup River. By the time it went public, the damage was significant. Fish kills, toxic soil, community water sources threatened. And yes, I had been the officer assigned to that region. But what the public didn't know, what even most of my colleagues didn't know, was that the leak wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A disposal operation run by a network that had been dumping industrial and medical waste illegally for years, moving it across state lines, falsifying records, bribing inspectors. I'd been investigating them for 9 months when the story broke. I was close, too close, and they knew it. So they forced my hand. They leaked documents that made it look like I'd known about the contamination for weeks and hadn't reported it. Made it seem like I was complicit or incompetent or both. The agency had 2 choices. Publicly defend me and risk exposing an ongoing federal investigation, or let me take the fall and preserve the case. I made the choice for them. I resigned. Quietly, no fight, no public defense. I let them think I'd screwed up. Let my family think I'd screwed up. And 3 days later, I got a phone call from a man who introduced himself only as Director Hammond. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Merrick, we've been following your work. What happened in Tacoma wasn't your fault, and we both know it. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to continue that work, but in a different capacity. Undercover. Off the books. No badge, no title, no public record." He explained that there was a task force, a small one, focused on environmental crime that crossed state and federal jurisdictions. The kind of crime that didn't make headlines until it was too late. Illegal dumping operations. Corporate cover-ups of toxic spills. Eco-terrorism plots. Things that fell through the cracks because no one agency had the resources or jurisdiction to pursue them fully. They needed people who could blend in, who could move quietly, who were willing to give up everything visible for the chance to do something that mattered. He told me I had 24 hours to decide. No pressure, he said, but I could hear in his voice that this wasn't the kind of offer that came around twice. I thought about my father's face at Thanksgiving. I thought about my mother's framed offer letter gathering dust in the hallway. I thought about the river in Tacoma, the dead fish, the families who didn't know their water was poisoned. And I called him back in 3 hours. "I'm in." The conditions were simple in theory, brutal in practice. I would resign publicly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I would sever all professional ties. I would not maintain a social media presence, would not update a resume, would not explain my work to anyone ever. I would work under aliases, move between cities as needed, and live a life that looked from the outside like I was drifting. No career, no stability, no success to point to. My family would think I'd failed. My friends would stop calling. I would become a ghost in my own life. But the work would matter. Over the next 8 years, I moved through Oregon, California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Washington. I took jobs that gave me access. Seasonal park ranger. Environmental cleanup crew. Temp work at processing plants. I looked like someone who couldn't hold down a real job, someone who was always starting over. And while I looked like that, I was documenting, recording, tracking. I helped dismantle a medical waste smuggling ring operating out of Reno. I traced a toxic ash dumping operation in rural Idaho back to a shell company in Delaware. I provided evidence that shut down an illegal pesticide production facility in eastern Oregon that was poisoning groundwater for 3 counties. I worked alone most of the time. Occasionally I'd meet with Director Hammond or another operative, usually in parking lots or hiking trailheads, conversations that looked like casual encounters. I lived in cheap apartments, drove old cars, wore clothes from thrift stores. I missed birthdays. I missed weddings. I missed my nephew's birth because I was in a trailer park outside Boise gathering evidence on a chemical distributor who was selling contaminated fertilizer to farms. And every time I came home, every time I saw my family, they looked at me with a little less hope. My brother stopped asking what I was doing for work. My sister stopped inviting me to things because she said it was too hard to explain to her friends who I was. My mother started saying things like, "We just want you to be happy, Jenna," which was her way of saying we've given up expecting you to be successful. And my father, he barely spoke to me at all. When I walked into a room, he'd find a reason to leave. When someone asked about me, he'd say, "She's figuring it out," in a tone that made it clear he didn't think I ever would. The worst part wasn't the judgment. It was that I understood it. I understood why they thought I'd failed. From the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. A promising career abandoned. Years spent bouncing between low-wage jobs in forgotten towns. No partner, no house, no kids, nothing they could brag about at church or book club or the grocery store. I had become the person they referenced when they wanted to make a point about wasted potential. And I let them. Because the alternative was breaking my NDA, risking prosecution, and destroying cases that had taken years to build. Cases that mattered more than my father's pride. So I stayed quiet. I showed up when I could. I endured the comments, the side glances, the whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. And I carried the weight of knowing that I was protecting people they'd never meet from dangers they'd never know existed. Some nights I'd lie awake in whatever apartment I was renting that month and wonder if it was worth it, if anyone would ever know. If I'd spend the rest of my life being the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the daughter who couldn't get it together. And then I'd get another call from Director Hammond, another case, another town, and I'd pack my bag and disappear again. Because the work didn't stop. The river still needed protecting. The community still needed someone watching. And I was good at it. Better than good. I was one of the best they had, which is why they kept sending me into harder situations, deeper cover, longer stretches of silence. By year 7, I'd stopped hoping my family would ask what really happened. Stopped hoping someone would look at me and say, "This doesn't add up. Something else is going on here." They didn't want to know. Knowing would have required them to confront the fact that they'd written me off without asking questions. It was easier to believe I'd failed than to consider they might have been wrong. So I let them believe it. And I kept working. Then 2 months ago I got an email. No sender name, just a string of characters I recognized as a secure government address. Subject line: Case status update. I opened it in a coffee shop in Portland, my hands shaking slightly even though I didn't want them to. The message was short. Merrick, Operation Clearwater has been successfully concluded. All associated cases have reached prosecution stage. Federal and state agencies have been briefed. Declassification protocols have been initiated. Your NDA restrictions will be lifted in 60 days. Director Hammond sends his regards. That was it. 8 years of silence and it was over. Not in a way that came with fanfare or parades, but in the way that mattered. The work was done. The cases were solid. People were going to be held accountable. And for the first time since I'd taken that phone call in a Seattle hotel room, I was allowed to exist again. I didn't tell my family. There was nothing to tell yet. And even if there had been, I wasn't sure what I'd say. "Hey, remember how you all thought I was a failure?" Surprise, I was actually working undercover for the federal government. Sounded absurd even in my head. So I stayed quiet. I went to the family reunion because my mother had asked, and because some part of me, the part that still remembered being the daughter they were proud of, wanted to show up. Wanted to be there, even if being there meant enduring my father's disappointment one more time. I didn't expect the governor. I didn't know she'd be there. That part was a coincidence or fate, or whatever you want to call it when timing aligns in a way that feels almost scripted. 3 weeks earlier, I'd gotten a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Miss Merrick, this is Chief of Staff Calloway from Governor Thornton's office. The governor would like to meet with you privately to express her gratitude for your work on Operation Clearwater. We understand your schedule is complex, but we'd appreciate the opportunity." I almost laughed. My schedule? Like I was some kind of executive with a packed calendar. But I said yes and we arranged a time. The location was my choice, and when I told them I'd be at my family reunion in Cedar Springs, there was a pause. Then Chief Calloway said, "We can make that work. The governor is attending an event in Eugene that day. We'll adjust her route." And that's how Governor Rachel Thornton ended up at a family barbecue in a town most people couldn't find on a map. I didn't plan to be standing by the drink table when my father made his announcement. I'd actually been considering leaving early, the way I usually did at these things. Show up, make an appearance, endure an hour of small talk and thinly veiled judgments, then slip out before anyone noticed. But Bridget had cornered me earlier, asking in that tone she used when she wanted to seem concerned but was really just curious. "So Jenna, what are you doing these days? Any job prospects?" I'd given her my standard answer. "Still figuring things out. Doing some contract work here and there." She'd nodded with that particular expression people make when they're trying to hide pity, then excused herself to check on her kids. That's when I'd retreated to the drink table, seeking refuge in a cup of overly sweet lemonade and the relative anonymity of standing near the ice chest. The reunion was in full swing by then. Folding tables arranged in a horseshoe under the pavilion, covered in checkered tablecloths that were fighting a losing battle against the August breeze. Paper plates stacked high, potato salad sweating in the heat, hamburgers and hot dogs coming off the grill in waves. Kids running between the tables, their voices shrill with the particular joy of summer and sugar. Adults clustered in groups, telling the same stories they told every year, laughing at the same jokes. My Uncle Frank was holding court near the grill, beer in hand, explaining to anyone who'd listen why the county commission was making a mistake about the new zoning laws. My Aunt Caroline was showing photos on her phone to a group of cousins, something about a cruise to Alaska. My mother was arranging desserts on a side table, obsessively straightening the placement of pies and cookies like their alignment mattered to anyone but her. My brother Kyle was sitting at the head table with Vanessa, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for successful people who summer in places with good wine. He was in pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my rent. She was in white linen that somehow wasn't stained despite being at a barbecue. Her hair in one of those perfectly messy buns that take 20 minutes to achieve. They were talking to Marcus, Bridget's husband, about investment properties or interest rates or some other topic that signaled you'd made it to the level where money made more money without you having to do anything. Bridget was nearby, simultaneously watching her 3 kids and scrolling through her phone, occasionally calling out warnings that no one heeded. "Don't run with that stick, Nathan. Lily, we do not throw food. Mason, if I have to tell you one more time." I stood there watching all of it like I was observing a documentary about a culture I used to belong to but had somehow left behind. These were my people technically. Same blood, same last name, same childhood memories of this very park where we'd had reunions for 35 consecutive years. But I felt like an anthropologist studying a tribe whose customs I no longer understood. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe they were the ones who'd stopped understanding me, stopped caring enough to ask the questions that might have led to uncomfortable answers. Either way, there was a distance between us that had nothing to do with the physical space of the pavilion, and everything to do with the 8 years of silence that had stretched between who I used to be and who I'd become. My father was standing near the center of the pavilion, holding a beer and talking to his brother Frank and a couple of cousins I only saw at these reunions. He'd been in a mood all afternoon, the kind of mood that meant he'd had 2 beers too many and was feeling philosophical in the way that made everyone around him uncomfortable. I'd been avoiding him successfully for most of the event, but I'd made the mistake of being visible at the wrong moment. He'd glanced over, seen me standing alone, and something in his face had shifted. That look I'd come to recognize over the years. Disappointment mixed with the kind of anger that comes from loving someone and feeling like they've let you down in a way you can't forgive. He raised his voice, not shouting exactly, but loud enough that conversations nearby started to fade. "Jenna's here," which is surprising since she usually can't commit to anything. A few people turned. Nervous laughter from somewhere. near the dessert table. My mother's face went tight, that expression she got when she wanted to intervene but couldn't figure out how to do it without making things worse. Kyle looked up from his conversation, eyebrows raised, but he didn't say anything. Vanessa whispered something to him behind her hand. My father wasn't done. He took another sip of his beer, shook his head like he was shaking off something heavy, and said the rest. Biggest disappointment of my life, if I'm being honest. The whole pavilion went quiet. Even the kids seemed to sense something had shifted, their voices dropping to whispers. Uncle Frank cleared his throat uncomfortably. Aunt Caroline put her phone down. Marcus suddenly became very interested in his plate of food. I stood there with my paper cup of lemonade, feeling 40 sets of eyes on me, waiting to see what I'd do, what I'd say, whether I'd fight back or cry or leave. I'd been in harder situations than this. I'd sat across tables from men who'd threatened my life. I'd stood in rooms where one wrong word could have blown my cover and gotten people killed. I'd learned how to keep my face neutral, my breathing steady, my voice calm no matter what was happening inside. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I showed nothing. I took a sip of my lemonade, set the cup down on the table beside me, and prepared to leave the way I always did. Quietly. Without fuss. Without giving them the satisfaction of seeing that the words landed, even though they did, even though 8 years of carrying them hadn't made them any lighter. That's when I heard the vehicles. Everyone did. The sound of engines, multiple engines moving in sync. Not the casual arrival of a late family member, but something more deliberate, more official. The kind of sound that makes people stop what they're doing and turn toward the parking lot, even before they can see what's coming. 3 black SUVs pulled into the gravel lot at the edge of the park, moving in formation, windows tinted dark enough that you couldn't see who was inside. They parked in a line precise as a military formation, and for a moment nothing happened. Just the sound of engines idling and the whole reunion standing frozen, watching. Uncle Frank made a joke, something about the FBI and Cousin Terry's taxes, and a few people laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from nervousness, not humor. My mother grabbed my father's arm. Whether to steady herself or stop him from saying something else I couldn't tell. Kyle stood up from his seat, straightening his polo like he might need to be presentable for whoever was about to emerge. Vanessa had her phone out, probably already composing a text to someone about the drama unfolding at the Merrick reunion. The doors opened simultaneously on all 3 vehicles. State troopers emerged first, 2 of them in full uniform, scanning the area with the kind of practiced efficiency that made it clear this wasn't their first protective detail. Then from the center vehicle, a woman stepped out. Even from across the parking lot, even before I could see her face clearly, I knew who she was. Governor Rachel Thornton. She was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but presence has nothing to do with height. She wore a navy suit despite the August heat, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her posture so straight it made everyone else around her seem to slouch by comparison. Her chief of staff emerged from the passenger side. A tall woman with silver hair and glasses, carrying a leather folder. They stood for a moment by the vehicles, the chief of staff saying something to the governor nodding, and then they began to walk. Not toward the pavilion entrance. Not toward the main gathering. Directly across the grass, past the folding tables, past the hamburger grill where smoke was still rising, past the clusters of family members who were now standing absolutely still with paper plates in their hands and mouths slightly open. Past my Uncle Frank, who'd stopped mid-sentence with his beer halfway to his lips. Past my cousins who were pulling out their phones to record whatever was about to happen. Past the dessert table where my mother stood with one hand still on a pie she'd been rearranging. Past Kyle and Vanessa. Past Bridget, who was holding Mason's hand so tight he was starting to squirm. Past Marcus, past my Aunt Caroline, past everyone. The governor walked with purpose, her heels crunching on the gravel path, then softer on the grass, her eyes fixed ahead. The state troopers flanked her at a respectful distance, their hands resting near their belts in that casual but ready stance that law enforcement uses. Her chief of staff walked slightly behind and to the left, still holding that leather folder. And they came directly to me. I set my cup down on the drink table, smoothed my hands on my jeans, a gesture I hadn't realized I was making until I was already doing it. Straightened my spine the way I'd learned to in 100 different situations where showing weakness wasn't an option. My heart was beating faster, but my breathing was steady. Years of training, years of practice, years of being in rooms where everything depended on staying calm. The governor stopped 3 feet from me. Close enough to be personal, far enough to be respectful. Her security detail stopped a few paces back, giving us space. Her chief of staff positioned herself to the side, professional and alert. Behind me, I could feel the entire reunion holding its breath. Not a sound except the wind moving through the trees and somewhere far off a dog barking. The governor smiled. Not a political smile. Not the one she used in press conferences or campaign ads. Something warmer, more genuine. She extended her hand, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the pavilion with the clarity of someone used to being heard. "Miss Merrick, thank you for making time. I know your schedule doesn't allow for much of this." I shook her hand, firm grip, the kind of handshake that means business. My voice when I spoke was steady, calm, professional. "Of course, Governor. Shall we talk inside?" She nodded, releasing my hand but maintaining eye contact in a way that conveyed respect, gratitude, things I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes when they looked at me in years. Together we turned and walked toward the pavilion's back room, a small enclosed space usually used for storage but private enough for a conversation. The state troopers followed at a distance. Her chief of staff moved ahead to check the room. And behind us, I didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. My family, my entire extended family, standing there in absolute shock silence. My father's beer probably forgotten in his hand. My mother's mouth probably open. Cal probably trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Bridget probably already texting someone. Uncle Frank probably speechless for the first time in his life. But I didn't turn around. Didn't look back. Didn't offer them an explanation or a glance or anything that might suggest I owed them one. I walked with the governor, my steps matching hers, my head high. And for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't the biggest disappointment. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the daughter they didn't know how to explain. I was someone important enough that the governor of Oregon had driven out of her way to a small-town family reunion to meet with me privately. And they'd all just watched it happen. The back room smelled like old wood and stored equipment. Folding chairs stacked against one wall. Boxes of decorations for various holidays. A push mower someone had forgotten to put back in the shed. The chief of staff had already done a quick sweep and positioned herself by the door, giving us privacy but remaining alert. One of the state troopers stood outside. The other had stayed near the vehicles. The governor waited until the door was closed before she spoke again. And when she did, her voice was quieter, more personal. "Miss Merrick, I've wanted to do this for 2 months. Ever since Director Hammond briefed me on Operation Clearwater, and your role in it." She gestured to one of the folding chairs and I unfolded too, setting them facing each other. We sat, and suddenly the formality dropped away. She wasn't the governor anymore. She was a mother. "You saved my daughter's life." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. I'd known about the connection, of course. Known that one of the cases I'd worked had involved contaminated water in a private school system, that we'd traced it back to illegal dumping near the school's well system, that we'd shut it down before anyone got seriously ill. But I hadn't known specifically which children had been at risk. They hadn't told me. They never told me details like that. The governor continued, reading my expression accurately. "Claire, my daughter, she's 14 now. She was in 6th grade when the contamination happened. She started getting sick. Headaches, nausea, fatigue. We thought it was stress from school. Then 3 other kids in her class got sick. Then 7. The school called in the health department, but by the time they were mobilizing resources, you'd already identified the source and the people responsible. You'd already provided enough evidence to shut down the entire operation. My daughter was in the hospital for 4 days. She recovered fully, thank God. But the doctors told us if the exposure had continued another 2 weeks, the damage would have been irreversible. I kept my face neutral, but something was shifting inside me. Something I'd kept locked down for years. The work had always been abstract. Cases, evidence, operations. I knew intellectually that what I did mattered, that shutting down illegal dumping operations and corporate pollution cover-ups meant protecting people. But I'd never met any of those people. Never put faces to the names. Never heard from someone whose child was one of the ones I'd helped protect. She reached into the leather folder her chief of staff had been carrying, pulled out a photo, and handed it to me. A girl with dark hair and braces, smiling at the camera, standing in front of what looked like a school. This is Claire last year at her 8th grade graduation. She's applying to high schools now. Wants to study environmental science. Because of what happened, because she wants to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids. I looked at the photo, at this girl who was alive and healthy and making plans for her future, because I'd spent 3 months living in a trailer park and working nights at a cleaning service to get access to shipping records. Because I'd missed my nephew's birth to follow a truck route. Because I'd let my family think I was a failure so I could do work that mattered. The governor's voice was soft now, almost tender. You gave up everything, didn't you? Your career, your reputation, your relationships. You let people think the worst of you so you could do this work. Director Hammond told me about the NDA restrictions. 8 years of silence. I don't know how you carried that. I handed the photo back, my throat tight. Someone had to. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Director Hammond also told me you're one of the best operatives they've ever had. That your work has been instrumental in 17 major cases across 6 states. That you've helped prevent what could have been catastrophic environmental disasters. That you've done all of this while living on a salary that barely covered rent and maintaining a cover that meant being treated like you'd failed at life. She paused, looking at me directly. I wanted to meet you in person to say thank you. Not as the governor, but as a mother. As someone whose child is alive because of what you sacrificed. There aren't many people who would do what you did. There aren't many people who could. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. 8 years of holding everything in, 8 years of letting people think the worst, 8 years of carrying the weight alone. And here was someone who knew, who understood, who was grateful. It broke something open inside me that I'd kept carefully sealed. Thank you, I managed. That means more than you know. She smiled. I wanted to do this privately, but when Chief Calloway told me you'd be at a family reunion, I thought perhaps having some witnesses might not be the worst thing. From what Director Hammond mentioned, your family hasn't been particularly understanding about your choices. I almost laughed. That's one way to put it. She stood and I stood with her. There's going to be some public recognition coming. The operation has been declassified. There will be press releases, probably some media coverage. The Attorney General wants to do a formal commendation ceremony in Salem next month. You'll be invited, obviously, but I understand if you prefer to decline. Some people who've worked undercover don't want the attention afterward. I thought about it. Thought about my father standing in the pavilion saying I was his biggest disappointment. Thought about 8 years of silence, 8 years of being invisible. Thought about that framed offer letter my mother had taken down from the hallway, because it was too painful to look at a reminder of what they thought I'd thrown away. I'll be there, I said. The governor extended her hand again and I shook it. Then she turned to her chief of staff. Think we can go. I've said what I came to say. As they prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Miss Merrick, one more thing. Your father, the one who was speaking when we arrived. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. She smiled, a small knowing smile. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who understand us the least. Not because they don't care, but because they're measuring us against the wrong standards. What you did required a kind of courage most people can't comprehend. I hope someday he realizes that. Then she was gone, her chief of staff and security detail following, their footsteps fading as they crossed back through the pavilion and out to the waiting vehicles. I stood alone in the storage room, surrounded by folding chairs and holiday decorations, and for the first time in 8 years I felt something I hadn't let myself feel. Pride. Not the kind that comes from external validation, but the kind that comes from knowing you did something that mattered, that you made choices that were hard and right, that you carried a burden no one else could see and you didn't break under the weight of it. I waited a few minutes before going back out. Let them start breathing again. Let them process what they just witnessed. Let them begin asking the questions they should have asked years ago. When I finally opened the door and stepped back into the pavilion, every single person was staring at me. The reunion had fractured into something else entirely. No one was eating. No one was talking. They were just standing there, looking at me like they'd never seen me before. Like I'd become a stranger in the seconds it took the governor to walk across the grass. My father was still near the center of the pavilion, but his beer was on the table now, forgotten. His face was pale, his expression somewhere between shock and confusion. My mother had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears in her eyes, though I couldn't tell if they were from relief or shame or some complicated mixture of both. Kyle had his phone out, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something like respect mixed with incomprehension. Bridget had let go of Mason's hand. He was tugging at her shirt, but she wasn't responding, just staring at me with wide eyes. Vanessa's perfectly composed expression had cracked. She looked genuinely stunned, her mouth slightly open, her phone hanging loosely in her hand. Uncle Frank had set down his beer and was gripping the back of a chair like he needed something to hold on to. Aunt Caroline was whispering urgently to the cousin next to her, but her eyes never left me. Marcus was frozen with a hamburger halfway to his mouth. The kids had stopped running. Even they sensed something monumental had just happened, though they couldn't possibly understand what. I walked slowly back to the drink table where I'd left my lemonade. Picked it up, took a sip, set it back down. The gesture was casual, deliberate. A message that said I wasn't going to explain, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to make this easier for them. My father finally found his voice. Jenna, who was that? Why did the governor? I looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Saw the confusion in his face, the beginning understanding that he'd gotten something fundamentally wrong. Saw the man who'd called me his biggest disappointment now realizing he'd been operating with incomplete information for 8 years. That was Governor Thornton, I said calmly. We had a meeting scheduled. My mother's voice was shaky. A meeting? About what? I could have told them. Could have explained everything, laid out the whole 8 years, made them understand what I'd been doing and why I'd let them believe the worst. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the realization that they'd had 8 years to ask, 8 years to wonder if maybe there was more to the story, 8 years to give me the benefit of the doubt. And they never did. They never asked. They just assumed. Kyle stepped forward, his lawyer brain trying to piece it together. The governor said your schedule doesn't allow for much. What schedule? What have you been doing? I met his eyes. I've been working. He shook his head, frustrated. Working on what? Where? Doing what? Why couldn't you tell us? The questions were coming now, too late, 8 years too late. I felt something hard settle in my chest. Because you never asked. The pavilion went silent again. My mother made a small sound, almost a sob. My father looked like I'd hit him. But I wasn't done. For 8 years I've come to these reunions, to holidays, to birthdays, and not once did any of you ask what really happened. Not once did you think maybe there's more to this story. You just decided I'd failed, and that was easier than wondering if you might be wrong. Bridget found her voice defensive. You resigned from your job. There was a scandal in the papers. What were we supposed to think? I turned to her. You were supposed to ask me. You were supposed to say, Jenna, this doesn't make sense. What really happened? Can you tell us? You were supposed to give me the benefit of the doubt instead of making me the cautionary tale at every family dinner. My father stepped forward, his voice rough. We tried to protect you. After that scandal, we didn't want to make it worse by bringing it up. I almost laughed. Protect me? By calling me your biggest disappointment in front of the entire family? By letting everyone make jokes about my failed career? By treating me like I was something to be ashamed of? He had no answer for that. None of them did. Kyle tried again, his voice softer now. If you were doing something important, why couldn't you tell us? Why did you let us think the worst? Because what I was doing was classified. Because telling you would have risked the work. Because the people I was protecting mattered more than your comfort or my reputation. Because sometimes doing the right thing means letting the people you love think you failed. My mother was crying now, openly. Oh Jenna, we didn't know, we didn't understand. I know, I said quietly. That's the problem. You didn't know because you never asked. You didn't understand because you never tried to. Vanessa, of all people, spoke up. So what were you doing? What was so important that you had to hide it from your own family? I looked at her, at all of them, and made a decision. You'll find out soon enough. There's going to be public recognition next month. A ceremony. Press coverage. You can read about it then like everyone else. I picked up my cup, drained the last of the lemonade, and set it down with finality. I'm going to leave now. Thank you for the invitation. I turned to walk away and my father's voice stopped me. Jenna, wait. Please. I paused but didn't turn around. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked. I should have trusted you. I stood there for a long moment feeling the weight of those words, the words I'd needed to hear for 8 years. They should have meant something. They should have fixed something. But they just felt late. Too late. I know you're sorry, I said without turning around. But sorry doesn't give me back 8 years of being the family embarrassment. Sorry doesn't undo every comment, every joke, every time you made me feel like I'd failed when I was actually succeeding in ways you couldn't imagine. I started walking again. Behind me I heard my mother say something to my father, heard Bridget call my name, heard Kyle say wait, let her go. But I didn't stop. I walked across the grass, past the folding tables with their checkered cloths fluttering in the breeze, past the grill where hamburgers were still cooking though no one was tending them anymore, past the kids who'd started playing again, oblivious to the adult drama, past the banner that said Merrick strong since 1989. I got to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that had seen better days but ran fine and was paid off, opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and finally let myself breathe. My hands were shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. 8 years of holding everything in and it was finally breaking open. Not in a way that felt like breaking though. In a way that felt like release. Like pressure that had been building and building finally finding a way out. I started the car, pulled out of the gravel lot, and drove away from the reunion. In my rearview mirror I could see people still standing in the pavilion, still watching me leave, probably still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Let them figure it out. Let them sit with the discomfort of realizing they'd been wrong. Let them wonder what else they'd gotten wrong about me, about my life, about the choices I'd made. I drove through Cedar Springs, past the hardware store where my father used to brag about me, past the church where my mother had made excuses for me, past the elementary school where I'd grown up believing family meant unconditional support. The town looked the same as it always had. Small, familiar, unchanged. But I'd changed. I wasn't the daughter who needed their approval anymore. I wasn't the woman who'd let their judgment define her worth. I was someone who'd done work that mattered. Someone who'd made sacrifices that protected people. Someone who'd carried a burden in silence because it was necessary. And now finally the silence was ending. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced at it at a red light. Text from Kyle. We need to talk. Please. There's so much we need to understand. I didn't respond. Let him sit with that need. Let him feel what it was like to want answers and not get them. Let him experience just a fraction of what I'd felt for 8 years. Another text, this one from Bridget. I'm sorry. We all are. Can we try again? Can you forgive us? Forgiveness. Such a simple word for such a complicated thing. Could I forgive them for 8 years of judgment? For making me the cautionary tale? For never once giving me the benefit of the doubt? Maybe. Eventually. But not today. Today I needed to sit with what had just happened. Needed to let it settle. Needed to feel the vindication fully before I could even begin to think about reconciliation. I drove out of Cedar Springs and onto the highway that would take me back to Portland. Back to my small apartment. Back to the life I'd built in the margins while everyone thought I was failing. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. My phone kept buzzing. More texts. Probably from my mother, maybe from my father, definitely from extended family who were just now realizing they'd been witnesses to something significant. I turned the phone face down and focused on the road. On the rhythm of the drive. On the feeling of having finally, after 8 years of silence, been seen for who I really was. The apartment was quiet when I got back. The kind of quiet that feels like relief after hours of noise and tension. I dropped my keys on the small table by the door, kicked off my shoes and stood for a moment in the entryway just breathing. The space was small, a one-bedroom in an older building in Northeast Portland, the kind of place that cost too much for what it was but was still the best I could afford on the salary I'd been making. Hardwood floors that creaked, windows that didn't quite seal properly, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. But it was mine, and after 8 years of temporary housing in a dozen different cities, having any place that felt permanent meant something. I'd moved here 2 years ago when my assignment shifted to focus primarily on cases in the Pacific Northwest. Before that it had been Sacramento for 18 months, Boise for a year, Reno for 9 months, a rotation of places that blurred together in memory. Cheap apartments, furnished rentals, extended stay motels when the work required it. I'd learned to live light, to keep possessions minimal, to make anywhere feel like nowhere because attachment was a liability when you might need to disappear on 12 hours' notice. This apartment was different though. I'd signed a real lease. Bought actual furniture instead of using whatever came with the place. Put pictures on the walls, mostly landscapes from places I'd worked. Nothing personal enough to tell a story, but enough to make the walls feel less empty. I had plants on the windowsill, 3 of them, succulents that could survive my frequent absences. I had books on a shelf, not many but more than I'd allowed myself to own in years. I had a coffee maker that wasn't borrowed and dishes that matched. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things people took for granted but that felt like luxury when you'd spent years living out of a duffel bag. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water from the tap, drank it standing at the sink while looking out the window at the building across the alley. Someone was cooking. I could see the warm glow of their kitchen light. Could smell something with garlic and onions drifting through the evening air. Normal life happening all around me, the kind of life I'd been adjacent to but never quite part of for nearly a decade. I refilled the glass, carried it to the living room, and sat on the couch I'd bought from a thrift store and reupholstered myself during a rare quiet month. The fabric was dark blue, practical, comfortable enough. I pulled out my phone, finally ready to look at the messages that had been accumulating during the drive. 17 texts. 3 voicemails. 2 missed calls. I scrolled through them slowly, reading each one, trying to gauge the emotional temperature of my family's reaction now that they'd had time to process. Kyle had sent 4 messages, each one progressively more detailed. The first was the one I'd seen at the red light, asking to talk. The second was longer, apologizing specifically for not asking questions, for assuming the worst, for making me feel unsupported. The third was him trying to piece together what I'd been doing, asking if it was FBI or CIA or something else entirely. The fourth was him admitting he had no right to ask but hoping I'd tell him anyway when I was ready. Bridget's messages were more emotional, lots of apologies, lots of "we had no idea," and "please don't shut us out," and "the kids are asking why Aunt Jenna left." My mother had sent 2 messages, both brief and shaky in tone even through text. "Please call when you can. I need to hear your voice. I need to know you're okay." My father hadn't texted. That didn't surprise me. He wasn't a text person under normal circumstances, and these circumstances were about as far from normal as our family had ever experienced. Uncle Frank had sent a message that was surprisingly thoughtful. "Jenna, I don't know what you were doing all these years, but I know I made jokes I shouldn't have made. I'm sorry for that. You're tougher than all of us combined and I should have remembered that." Aunt Caroline's message was shorter. "We're all in shock here. Call your mother. She's worried sick." Various cousins had sent variations of "what just happened?" and "are you okay?" And that was incredible. Vanessa, interestingly, had sent nothing. Maybe she was still processing. Maybe she was embarrassed about the assumptions she'd made. Maybe she just didn't know what to say. The voicemails were all from my mother, each one more tearful than the last. I listened to the first one. Her voice was thick with crying, breaking on certain words. "Jenna, honey, please pick up. I know you're probably angry with us, you have every right to be angry, but please just let me know you're safe. Your father is, he's just sitting here, he won't talk, he won't eat, I've never seen him like this. Please call. I love you. I'm so sorry we didn't understand. I'm so sorry." I set the phone down without listening to the other voicemails. I'd call her eventually, probably tomorrow, when I had the emotional capacity to handle that conversation. Right now I needed space. Needed time to process what had happened, what it meant, how it changed things or didn't change things. The vindication had felt good in the moment, watching their faces as the governor walked past everyone to speak with me specifically. Watching them realize they'd gotten it wrong. But now, sitting alone in my quiet apartment with the adrenaline fading, I wasn't sure what I felt. Relief, definitely. Validation, absolutely. But also something heavier, something that felt like grief. Grief for the 8 years that could have been different if they just asked. If they just trusted me enough to think maybe there was more to the story. If they just loved me enough to give me the benefit of the doubt instead of writing me off as a disappointment. I thought about my father's face when the governor stopped in front of me. The shock, the confusion, the beginning realization that he'd said something he couldn't take back. Biggest disappointment of my life. He'd said it in front of everyone. Made it public. Made it real in a way that all the smaller comments and side glances never quite had. And then minutes later he'd watched the governor salute everything he thought I wasn't. I should have felt triumphant. Should have felt like I'd won something. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of carrying the secret. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of the gap between who I was and who they thought I was. Even now, even with the truth starting to come out, that gap felt impossibly wide. How do you bridge 8 years of silence? How do you rebuild trust that was never there to begin with? How do you forgive people for not asking the questions they should have asked? I didn't have answers. I stood up, walked to the bedroom, changed out of the clothes I'd worn to the reunion. Jeans and a simple shirt, nothing fancy, the kind of outfit that said I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I folded them carefully and put them in the drawer, then pulled on sweatpants and an old t-shirt from a 5K I'd run years ago in Seattle, back when I still had a normal job and a normal life. I caught sight of myself in the mirror above the dresser. I looked tired. Not just today tired, but years tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and doesn't leave even after a full night's sleep. I had lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when I started this work. Gray hairs I kept meaning to do something about but never bothered with. I looked older than 32. Felt older too. But there was something else in my reflection, something I hadn't seen in a while. A steadiness. A certainty. The look of someone who'd done hard things and survived them. Someone who'd made choices that cost them everything and still believed those choices were right. I turned away from the mirror, went back to the living room, and opened my laptop. I had an email from Director Hammond, sent an hour ago. The subject line just said, "Well done." I opened it. "Merrick, heard about the impromptu meeting with Governor Thornton at your family event. Unorthodox timing but effective. The declassification is proceeding on schedule. Press release will go out next Friday. Attorney General's office has confirmed the ceremony date as September 15th. Your attendance is requested but not required. Regardless of your decision, I want you to know that your work over the past 8 years has been exceptional. You've conducted yourself with integrity, discipline, and courage under circumstances that would have broken most people. The country is safer because of what you've done, even if most people will never know it. You should be proud." I certainly am. Hammond. I read it 3 times, feeling something warm and complicated settle in my chest. Pride, yes, but also a sense of completion. The work was done. The cases were solid. The silence was ending. I could exist again in the way I'd existed before, with a name and a history and a future that wasn't classified. I could tell people what I did for a living. I could put my real work experience on a resume. I could stop pretending to be someone I wasn't. The thought was almost dizzying. For 8 years my entire life had been structured around secrecy, around maintaining a cover, around being invisible. I'd gotten good at it, so good that sometimes I forgot where the cover ended and I began. But now I didn't have to do that anymore. I could just be Jenna Merrick, environmental crime investigator, federal operative, someone who'd spent 8 years doing work that mattered. The question was whether I wanted to. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch cushions, staring at the ceiling. The ceremony would be public. Press coverage meant news articles, probably local television, maybe even national if it was a slow news day. My name would be out there, attached to the cases I'd worked, the operations I'd been part of. My family would read about it. My old colleagues from the state agency would read about it. Everyone in Cedar Springs would read about it. They'd all know what I'd been doing, why I'd left, what I'd sacrificed. Part of me wanted that. Wanted the vindication to be complete. Wanted everyone who judged me to see exactly how wrong they'd been. But another part of me wondered if it mattered. If public recognition would actually change anything, or if it would just add noise to a story that was already complicated enough. The people who needed to know already knew. The governor knew. Director Hammond knew. The task force knew. The prosecutors working the cases knew. Did I need everyone else to know too? Did I need my father to read about my accomplishments in the newspaper because he'd never bothered to ask about them in person? My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it cautiously, wondering if somehow press had already gotten my contact information. But the message was simple and unsigned. Heard what happened today. Couldn't have happened to a better person. You earned this. Torres. Agent Torres, one of the few people I'd worked with directly during a case in Nevada 3 years ago. We'd spent 2 months tracking a chemical disposal operation, living in adjacent motel rooms, coordinating surveillance, building evidence. She'd been good at the work, professional and thorough, and we'd gotten along in the way people do when they're united by a common purpose. We hadn't stayed in touch after the case wrapped. That wasn't how this work operated. But apparently word traveled fast in the small community of people who did what we did. I typed back a quick response. Thanks. Strange day. Hope you're well. Her reply came seconds later. Understatement of the year. Enjoy it. You've earned the right to be visible again. Visible again. The phrase stuck with me. For 8 years I'd been invisible by design, by necessity, by choice. I'd moved through the world like a ghost, present but not really there, seen but not recognized. I'd gotten so used to it that visibility felt foreign now, almost uncomfortable. Like stepping into bright light after years in shadow. My eyes needed time to adjust. My sense of self needed time to recalibrate. I wasn't sure yet who I was without the cover, without the secrecy, without the constant weight of carrying information I couldn't share. I stood up, restless, and walked to the window. The sun had set fully now, the sky that deep blue that comes right before true darkness. Lights were on in windows across the alley, in the buildings beyond, dozens of lives happening simultaneously, people cooking dinner and watching television and putting kids to bed and arguing and laughing and living. For 8 years I'd watched that kind of life from the outside, always separate, always apart. Maybe now I could be part of it again. Maybe now I could have friendships that weren't filtered through cover stories. Relationships that didn't require lies of omission. A life that belonged to me instead of to the work. The thought was appealing and terrifying in equal measure. I'd gotten good at being alone. Good at not needing people. Good at finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than in external validation or connection. But good at something doesn't mean you want to keep doing it forever. Doesn't mean you don't sometimes ache for something different. Something easier. Something that doesn't require you to maintain emotional distance from everyone around you. I thought about the reunion, about my family standing there in shock. About Kyle trying to process what he'd witnessed. About Bridget realizing all her assumptions had been wrong. About my mother crying. About my father sitting in silence according to my mother's voicemail, unable to eat or talk. Part of me felt sympathy for them. They hadn't known. They'd made judgments based on incomplete information. And yes, they should have asked for more information, should have trusted me more, but they were human. They'd made mistakes. They'd hurt me, but not maliciously. Just thoughtlessly. Just by failing to see past the surface of things. But another part of me, a harder part that had been forged over 8 years of silence and judgment, wasn't ready to let them off the hook that easily. Because the thing was, they could have asked. Nothing had prevented them from picking up the phone and saying, "Jenna, what really happened? Can you tell me anything?" They'd chosen not to. Chosen to believe the worst instead. Chosen their comfortable narrative over the harder work of understanding. And that choice had cost me something. Had cost me birthdays and holidays and family dinners where I felt like I belonged. Had cost me support during years when I desperately needed it. Had cost me the sense that my family was a place I could return to and be accepted. You don't get those years back. You don't undo that damage with apologies and shock and sudden understanding. Maybe with time, maybe with effort, maybe with genuine change in how they treated me going forward. But not overnight. Not with a few text messages and voicemails. I turned away from the window and checked the time. Almost 9. I hadn't eaten since lunch, should probably make something, but I wasn't hungry. My body was still running on adrenaline and emotion, too keyed up to think about food. I made chamomile tea instead. Something I'd started doing during long nights when I needed to calm down, but couldn't afford to cloud my judgment with anything stronger. The ritual of it was soothing. Boiling water, steeping the tea bag, waiting for it to cool enough to drink. Simple, repetitive, grounding. I carried the mug back to the couch and picked up my phone again, scrolling past the family messages to the email from Director Hammond. September 15th, 3.5 weeks away. Enough time to prepare, to decide if I wanted to attend, to figure out what I'd say if there were speeches or interviews or any of the formal recognition that apparently came with declassification. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Wasn't used to talking about my work. For 8 years the whole point had been to stay invisible, to blend in, to never draw attention to myself. Standing on a stage and accepting recognition felt contrary to every instinct I developed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe part of moving forward meant learning to be visible again. Learning to accept acknowledgement, learning to exist in a space where my work wasn't secret and my identity wasn't hidden. Maybe I owed it to myself to show up and be recognized after 8 years of letting people think I'd failed. Or maybe I didn't owe anyone anything. Maybe I could skip the ceremony and the press and the public recognition and just move forward quietly into whatever came next. Take a new job, maybe with the task force in an official capacity now that I didn't have to hide it. Or leave government work entirely and do something completely different. Use my experience in environmental protection to work for a nonprofit or a research organization. Start over in a way that was actually starting over, not just changing covers. The possibilities felt overwhelming. For 8 years my path had been clear. Do the work. Maintain the cover. Don't get caught. Now the path split in dozens of directions and I had no map, no instructions, no Director Hammond sending me encrypted messages about where to go next. I had choice, real choice, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. My tea had cooled enough to drink. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me. The chamomile already starting to ease the tension in my shoulders. Tomorrow I'd call my mother. Tomorrow I'd start figuring out what came next. Tomorrow I'd begin the complicated process of rebuilding or redefining, or maybe just accepting what my relationship with my family would look like going forward. But tonight I just needed to sit with what had happened. Needed to let it settle into my bones, into my memory, into the story I told myself about who I was and what I'd done. The governor had called me courageous. Director Hammond had called me exceptional. Agent Torres had said I'd earned the right to be visible. But sitting alone in my quiet apartment, I didn't feel courageous or exceptional. I just felt like someone who'd made a choice and lived with the consequences. Someone who'd carried a weight because someone had to carry it. Someone who'd done her job, even when her job required her to sacrifice things most people wouldn't understand. The validation was nice. The recognition was meaningful. But it didn't change the fundamental truth that had kept me going through 8 years of silence. The work had mattered. The cases I'd helped build would put people in prison who deserved to be there. The operations I'd been part of had prevented environmental disasters that would have hurt communities, poisoned water, destroyed ecosystems. I'd helped protect people who would never know my name, and that had to be enough. Would always be enough regardless of whether anyone else ever understood. I finished my tea, rinsed the mug in the sink, and got ready for bed. Brushed my teeth, washed my face, set an alarm for tomorrow even though I had nowhere specific to be. Routines mattered, especially when everything else felt unstable. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up, and lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the building settling, the faint traffic noise from the street, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a life that was mine, however small and simple it might appear from the outside. My phone buzzed one more time on the nightstand. I almost ignored it, but something made me reach for it. One new message from my father. Just 4 words. I'm proud of you. I stared at the screen, reading those words over and over, feeling something crack open in my chest that I'd kept carefully sealed for 8 years. 4 words. Such small words. Such insufficient words for everything that had happened, everything that had been said and not said, all the hurt and judgment and disappointment. But they were something. They were a beginning, maybe. An acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, that I'd been right, that the daughter he'd written off as a failure had actually been succeeding in ways he'd never imagined. I didn't respond. Wasn't ready to respond. But I didn't delete the message either. Just set the phone back on the nightstand and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more conversations, more figuring out how to move forward. But tonight I let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in years. The satisfaction of being understood, even if it came too late. The peace of knowing the truth was finally slowly beginning to surface. The quiet comfort of knowing that whatever happened next, I'd survived the hardest part. I'd carried the burden of silence and I hadn't broken. And that was enough. For tonight, that was more than enough. I fell asleep with my father's message still glowing on my phone screen. For words that couldn't fix 8 years but might, possibly, be the first step toward something different. Something that looked less like disappointment and more like the pride I'd earned but never thought I'd receive. Something that felt cautiously and carefully like hope. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the gap in the curtains and the realization that I'd slept through the night without waking once. That was rare. For 8 years I'd been a light sleeper, trained by necessity to wake at the smallest unusual sound, always half alert even in rest. But last night I'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that comes when your body finally believes it's safe to fully let go. I checked my phone. 8:30 in the morning. 23 new messages. I scrolled through them quickly, noting that my family had apparently spent the evening and early morning processing everything. More apologies from Kyle, more tearful messages from my mother. A longer message from Bridget that actually seemed thoughtful rather than defensive. And that text from my father still sitting there from last night. "I'm proud of you." I sat up in bed, my back against the headboard, and read through Bridget's message more carefully. "Jenna, I've been up half the night thinking about everything. About how we treated you. About all the comments I made, all the assumptions. I kept trying to remember if there was ever a moment where you seemed like you wanted to tell us something and we shut you down, and honestly I think there were dozens of those moments. Times when you'd start to say something and then stop. Times when you'd look like you were carrying something heavy and we just changed the subject because it was uncomfortable. I did that. I know I did that. And I'm sorry doesn't feel like enough, but I am. I'm so sorry. Marcus and I were talking and he pointed out that you never asked us for anything. Never asked for money or help or even just for us to listen. You just kept showing up to family things and taking whatever we said and never defending yourself. He said that takes either weakness or incredible strength, and now we know which one it was. The kids keep asking when Aunt Jenna is coming back. Nathan said he thinks you must be a spy because why else would the governor come to see you? He thinks that's the coolest thing ever. I'd like to tell him the real story someday if you'll let me. I'd like my kids to know that their aunt is someone who sacrificed everything to protect people. Someone who did the right thing even when it cost her. I want them to grow up knowing that kind of courage exists. Anyway, I know you probably need space. But whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. Really here, not just saying it. Love you. I read it twice, feeling the knot in my chest loosen slightly. It wasn't everything. It didn't undo 8 years. But it was honest in a way my family rarely was, acknowledging specific failures rather than offering vague apologies. And the part about her kids, about wanting them to know the real story, that meant something. That suggested she understood this wasn't just about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. This was about who I actually was versus who they decided I was. I set the phone aside and got out of bed, padding to the bathroom to shower. The hot water felt good, grounding, washing away the residue of yesterday's tension. I stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting my mind wander through the previous day's events. The reunion. My father's words. The SUVs pulling into the parking lot. The governor's salute. Her handshake, her gratitude. The walk back through the pavilion with everyone staring. The drive home in silence. My father's text message in the dark. It all felt both vivid and distant, like something that had happened to someone else, or in a dream, or in a story I'd heard rather than lived. But it had happened. It was real. And now I had to figure out what to do with that reality. After showering I made coffee, real coffee from beans I'd ground myself, another small luxury I'd allowed myself since settling in Portland. I scrambled eggs, made toast, ate standing at the kitchen counter while looking out the window at the morning. The building across the alley had laundry hanging on a balcony, sheets and towels moving gently in the breeze. Someone's regular life, happening in full view, uncomplicated and ordinary. I wanted that. Wanted ordinary. Wanted to do laundry and hang it out and have that be the most significant thing happening in my day. Maybe that was possible now. Maybe ordinary was finally within reach. My phone rang while I was washing dishes. My mother. I stared at it for 3 rings, then dried my hands and answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was thick with emotion but steadier than I'd expected. "Jenna, thank you for answering. I wasn't sure you would." I moved to the couch, settled into the corner with my feet tucked under me. I needed some time to process. It was a lot. She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was a lot for us two. Honey, I don't even know where to start. Your father and I, we've been up all night talking. Really talking, not just him sitting there in silence like he does. He's been, God, Jenna, I've never seen him like this. He keeps saying he failed you. That he should have known better. That he should have asked. I didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air. Finally I said, he should have asked. You all should have. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again her voice was smaller. I know. You're right. We should have. I kept telling myself we were respecting your privacy, giving you space to figure things out. But that was just an excuse, wasn't it? The truth is it was easier to assume you'd made mistakes than to confront the possibility that we were wrong about you. The honesty surprised me. My mother had always been conflict-averse, the family peacemaker who smoothed over tensions, rather than addressing them directly. Hearing her acknowledge the real issue without softening it felt significant. It hurt, I said quietly. Watching you all decide who I was without asking me. Being treated like I was something to be ashamed of. Coming to family events and feeling like I didn't belong because I couldn't explain myself and you wouldn't give me the benefit of the doubt. My mother's breath caught. I know it hurt. And I am so sorry, Jenna. Not just sorry it happened, but sorry for my part in it. Sorry for all the times I let your father say things without stopping him. Sorry for the comments I made myself. Sorry for taking down that framed letter because looking at it made me sad. Sorry for treating you like you'd wasted your potential when actually you were using it in ways I couldn't imagine. She paused, and I could hear her gathering courage for the next part. Can you tell me about it? About what you were doing? I know you probably can't share everything, but I need to understand. I need to know who my daughter really is, not the version I created in my head. So I told her. Not everything, there were still operational details that would remain classified even after the declassification, but the broad strokes. The scandal that wasn't really a scandal. The recruitment into the task force. The 8 years of undercover work tracking environmental crime across 6 states. The cases I'd helped build, the operations I'd been part of, the communities I'd helped protect. The aliases and cover jobs and constant moving. The loneliness of living a life I couldn't share. The choice to let my family think I'd failed because the alternative was risking the work. I talked for nearly 30 minutes, my mother occasionally asking quiet questions but mostly just listening. When I finished there was a long silence on her end. Then she said, voice breaking, "You were protecting people. All those years you were protecting people and we thought you were just drifting. Oh Jenna. Oh sweetheart." I felt my own throat tighten. Yeah. She was crying now, really crying. I'm so proud of you. I know I have no right to say that after everything, but I am. You're the bravest person I know and I'm ashamed it took the governor showing up for me to see it. I wiped at my own eyes with the back of my hand. I'm not that brave, Mom. I just did what needed to be done. Someone had to do it and they asked me and I said yes. She made a sound of disagreement. That's exactly what bravery is. Doing what needs to be done even when it costs you everything. Especially when it costs you everything. We talked for another 20 minutes, the conversation gradually shifting from heavy to lighter. She told me about the aftermath at the reunion. How the whole family had stayed for hours after I left. Everyone trying to process what they'd witnessed. How Uncle Frank had apparently given a speech about how the Merricks had always been made of tough stuff and now everyone knew it. How Aunt Caroline had cried and said she felt terrible about the gossip she'd spread. How the cousins had all wanted to know more, to understand exactly what I'd been doing. My mother said Cal had gone into full lawyer mode, trying to research what cases might have been mine based on the timeline and the states I'd mentioned visiting over the years. Bridget had apparently spent an hour looking at old photos of me at various family events, pointing out to Marcus all the times I'd looked exhausted or distant or like I was carrying something no one else could see. We saw what we wanted to see, my mother said quietly. Or didn't want to see, I guess. We saw someone who wasn't succeeding by our definitions and we stopped looking deeper. That's on us. That's on me. I wanted to be angry still. Part of me was angry still. But hearing her genuine remorse, her clear understanding of what had gone wrong and why, made it harder to hold on to that anger with the same intensity. What happens now? I asked. She sighed. I don't know. What do you want to happen? I considered the question. What did I want? Did I want my family back in the way I'd had them before the scandal, before the judgment, before the 8 years of silence? That was impossible. Too much had happened, too much hurt had accumulated. But did I want some version of relationship with them going forward? Did I want to try to rebuild something new, something more honest? I don't know either, I admitted. I think I need more time. And I think when we do start trying to fix this, it can't just be about everyone suddenly being proud now that they know the truth. It has to be about acknowledging that you all hurt me, that you made assumptions and judgments and you hurt me for years. We can't just skip past that part. My mother's voice was firm. We won't. I promise you we won't. Your father wants to talk to you when you're ready. He's having a hard time forgiving himself. I think he needs to hear from you that someday, maybe not now but someday, you might be able to forgive him. The anger flared again, hot and sharp. He needs that? What about what I need? I needed him to trust me. I needed him to not call me his biggest disappointment in front of the entire family. I needed him to be my father instead of my judge. I heard her take a shaky breath. You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. I just meant whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, he wants to talk. But there's no pressure. You take all the time you need. We wrapped up the conversation shortly after that, both of us emotionally exhausted. Before hanging up, she said, I love you, Jenna. I've always loved you. Even when I was being stupid and blind and hurtful. And I'm going to do better. We all are. Believed her mostly. Or at least I believe she believed it. Whether they'd actually do better, whether they'd follow through when the shock wore off and life returned to normal, that remained to be seen. I spent the rest of the morning answering a few of the other messages, keeping my responses brief. I thanked Kyle for his apology and told him I appreciated that he was trying to understand, but I needed some space before we had any deep conversations. I responded to Bridget's long message with a simple, thank you for being honest. I'd like to talk more when I'm ready. I sent nothing to my father. His 4 words from last night still sat unanswered and would stay that way until I figured out what I wanted to say back. If I wanted to say anything back. Around noon I got a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously, wondering if it was press somehow. But the voice on the other end was professional and familiar. Miss Merrick, this is Chief of Staff Calloway from Governor Thornton's office. Do you have a moment? I sat up straighter instinctively, as if she could see me through the phone. Yes, of course. Her tone was warm. The governor wanted me to follow up after yesterday's meeting. First, to apologize if the timing caused any family tension. That wasn't our intention, though I suspect it may have actually been beneficial in your case. I almost laughed. That's one way to put it. She continued, second, the governor wanted to make sure you're planning to attend the ceremony next month. She'd like to present your commendation personally. It would mean a great deal to her and, frankly, to everyone who's been briefed on your work. I hesitated. I'm still deciding. It's not really my style, the public recognition. Chief Calloway's voice softened. I understand. The governor mentioned you might feel that way. But I hope you'll consider that this isn't just about you. It's about showing other people, especially young people, that there are careers in public service that require real sacrifice. That there are people doing important work in ways the public never sees. Your story matters, Miss Merrick. Not because you need the recognition, but because other people need to know that people like you exist. I hadn't thought about it that way. Hadn't considered that showing up might mean something beyond my own vindication or closure. I'll think about it, I said finally. She seemed satisfied with that. That's all we ask. The invitation is open regardless. The ceremony is at 2 p.m. on September 15th at the state capitol. Business attire. There will be press, but you're not obligated to do interviews if you'd prefer not to. The governor will make remarks, you'll receive the commendation, and that's it. 15 minutes, maybe 20. She gave me her direct number in case I had questions, and we ended the call. I sat holding my phone, thinking about what she'd said. About my story matching to other people. About young people who might be considering careers in public service and need to know that sometimes the most important work happens in silence. About showing up not for myself but for the principle of the thing. The afternoon drifted by in a haze of small tasks. I did laundry finally. Went to the grocery store and bought actual food instead of just whatever was quick. Cleaned the apartment even though it wasn't particularly dirty. Normal things, grounding things, the kind of tasks that reminded me I had a life beyond the work and the family drama and the weight of the past 8 years. Around 5 my phone rang again. Kyle this time. I almost didn't answer but something made me pick up. Hey. His voice was cautious. Hey, is this an okay time? I sat on the couch with a basket of clean laundry I'd been about to fold. Yeah, it's fine. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. I've been thinking about what to say to you for like 24 hours straight. and I still don't have the right words. So I'm just going to be honest and probably mess it up, but here goes. I failed you as a brother. Not just in the last 8 years, but probably before that too. I got so wrapped up in my own career and my own life that I stopped really seeing you. And when the scandal happened and you left your job, I just accepted the surface explanation because it was easier than questioning it. Because questioning it would have meant admitting I didn't actually know what was going on in your life. That I hadn't asked, hadn't stayed close, hadn't been someone you felt you could talk to. I stayed quiet, letting him continue. Vanessa and I talked last night and she pointed out something I didn't want to hear. She said I've always been competitive with you. Ever since we were kids. That I liked being the successful one, the one Dad bragged about, and when you seemed to be struggling I wasn't upset about it the way I should have been. I was relieved in some messed up way that I didn't have to compete anymore. And hearing her say that, God, Jenna, I wanted to argue but I couldn't because she was right. His voice cracked slightly. I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed it took the governor showing up to make me realize what kind of person I've been. What kind of brother I've been. I picked up a shirt from the laundry basket, folded it slowly while I processed what he'd said. It was more honest than I'd expected. More self-aware. Thank you for telling me that, I said finally. That couldn't have been easy to admit. He laughed bitterly. Nothing about this is easy. But you deserve honesty. You've been honest your whole life. Even when honesty meant letting us think the worst of you. So yeah, the least I can do is be honest now. We talked for almost an hour, a real conversation, maybe the first real one we'd had in years. He asked questions about the work I'd done. Respectful questions that didn't push for classified details. I asked about his life, his job, his marriage to Vanessa. We found common ground in unexpected places, discovered we both liked the same podcast about environmental policy, laughed about shared memories from childhood that neither of us had thought about in decades. By the time we hung up I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a path toward it. Maybe the possibility of rebuilding something that looked different from what we'd had but might actually be better. More honest. More real. That evening I sat down with my laptop and drafted an email to Director Hammond. I told him I'd attend the ceremony. That I'd reconsidered and decided it was important to show up. Not just for myself but for the principle of the work. That I wanted to represent the people who did this kind of job, who made these kinds of sacrifices, who carried these burdens in silence. I told him I was proud of the work we'd done and grateful for the opportunity to have been part of it. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. His response came 30 minutes later. Excellent. You'll do great. See you on the 15th. Simple, straightforward, classic Hammond. I closed the laptop and stood at the window watching the sun set over Portland, the sky turning shades of orange and pink, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there my family was having their own reckonings, their own conversations, their own attempts to process what they'd learned. Somewhere the governor was preparing remarks for a ceremony that would acknowledge work most people would never fully understand. Somewhere cases I'd helped build were moving through the justice system, holding people accountable for crimes that had threatened communities and ecosystems. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange liminal space. I talked to my mother every few days, short conversations that slowly rebuilt connection. I had 2 more long calls with Kyle, each one feeling slightly less awkward than the last. Bridget sent me photos of her kids with captions like, "Nathan insists you're a superhero now," and "Lily wants to be just like Aunt Jenna when she grows up." I still hadn't responded to my father's text. Wasn't ready for that conversation yet, might not be ready for a while. But I read his words every night before bed. I'm proud of you. For words that couldn't fix everything but were at least a start. I bought a suit for the ceremony, navy blue, professional, the kind of outfit that said I took this seriously. I practiced what I might say if anyone asked me questions, though I hoped I could avoid interviews. I prepared myself mentally for being in the public eye, for having my name attached to the work, for stepping out of the shadows I'd inhabited for so long. September 15th arrived clear and warm. One of those perfect early fall days where summer hasn't quite let go but autumn is making its presence known in the quality of the light. I drove to Salem, the state capital, arriving an hour early as instructed. Chief of Staff Calloway met me at a side entrance, guided me through security, brought me to a private room where I could wait before the ceremony. "You look perfect," she said, appraising my suit. Professional, serious, exactly the image we want. The governor came in shortly after, also in a suit, her expression warm when she saw me. Miss Merrick, I'm so glad you decided to come. We shook hands and she gestured to a chair. I wanted a moment before we go out there to thank you again personally, and to tell you that what you did matters more than you probably realize. The cases you worked, the operations you were part of, they've set precedents. They've shown what's possible when we prioritize environmental crime at the federal level. You helped build a framework that's going to protect communities for decades. I felt my throat tighten. I was just doing my job. She smiled. That's what all the best people say. The ones who do it for the right reasons, because it needs to be done, not because they want recognition. But today you're going to get recognition anyway. And I hope you'll accept it gracefully, on behalf of everyone who does this kind of work. We walked together to the ceremony room, a formal space with wood paneling and state seals and rows of chairs filled with people. Press lined the back wall, cameras ready. I saw state legislators, agency directors, law enforcement officials, people whose names I recognized from briefings and case files. And in the third row, somehow impossibly, my family. All of them. My mother and father sitting together. My father in a suit I'd only seen him wear to weddings and funerals. Kyle and Vanessa beside them. Bridget and Marcus with the kids. Nathan wearing a clip-on tie and looking thrilled to be somewhere important. Uncle Frank and Aunt Caroline. Even cousins I barely knew. My mother caught my eye and pressed her hand to her heart. My father met my gaze and nodded just once, a gesture that carried weight I couldn't quite name. Kyle gave me a thumbs up. Bridget was crying already. The ceremony was exactly what Chief Calloway had promised. Brief, formal, meaningful. The governor spoke about the importance of environmental protection, about the dedicated people who work to keep communities safe from corporate negligence and criminal activity. She spoke about sacrifice and service and the quiet heroes who never sought spotlight. Then she called my name and I walked to the front of the room, my steps steady, my head high. She presented the commendation, a framed certificate with official seals and language about meritorious service and dedication to protecting public health and natural resources. We shook hands while cameras flashed. She leaned in and whispered, "Claire is watching this online. She wanted you to know she's grateful." I whispered back, "Tell her I'm glad she's okay." Then it was over. The governor made closing remarks, thanked everyone for attending, and the ceremony concluded. People began filtering out, some approaching to shake my hand and offer congratulations. I handled it the way I've been trained to handle difficult situations, with calm professionalism and minimal emotion. But inside I was vibrating with something I couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Completion. The sense that a chapter was finally truly closed. My family waited until most people had left before approaching. My mother hugged me first, crying into my shoulder. "I'm so proud of you. So proud." Kyle hugged me next, squeezing tight. "You're amazing. I hope you know that." Bridget was sobbing openly, barely able to get words out. "You're the coolest person I know. The absolute coolest." The kids crowded around asking questions. Was I really a spy? Did I have a secret identity? Had I caught bad guys? I answered as best I could in ways they'd understand, watching their faces light up with excitement. Then everyone stepped back and it was just me and my father standing 2 feet apart, the rest of the family giving us space. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, more uncertain. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Jenna, I don't know how to apologize for what I said, for what I thought, for 8 years of being wrong about you." I looked at him, at this man who'd raised me and disappointed me and hurt me, and was now standing in front of me trying to find words big enough for the gap between us. "You should have known better," I said quietly. "You should have known me better." He nodded, his eyes wet. "I should have. You're right. I should have known that if you walked away from something it was because you had a good reason. I should have known you don't quit. You never quit anything in your life. I should have asked what really happened instead of just believing the worst." I felt tears pressing at the back of my own eyes. "Yeah, you should have." He took a step closer. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking if someday you might be able to forgive me. Not today, maybe not for a long time, but someday. Because you're my daughter and I love you and I'm more proud of you than I've ever been of anything in my entire life." I looked at him for a long moment, at the genuine remorse in his face, at the hope and fear warring in his expression. I thought about 8 years of carrying his disappointment like a stone. I thought about standing in that pavilion and hearing him call me his biggest failure. I thought about last night, reading his text message for the 100th time. "I'm proud of you." For words. Such small, insufficient words. But also a beginning. "Maybe someday," I said finally. "But you're right. Not today. Today I just need you to understand what you did and what it cost me." He nodded, accepting that. "I understand. And I'll spend however long it takes making sure you know I see you now. The real you. The one I should have seen all along." We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment yet. But he extended his hand and I shook it, formal and careful. A truce if not a resolution. The family wanted to go to dinner to celebrate, but I begged off, claiming exhaustion, which was true enough. I needed space, needed time alone to process everything that had just happened. I drove back to Portland as the sun set, watching the landscape change from the formal government buildings of Salem to the urban sprawl of the metro area to the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I parked in my usual spot, climbed the stairs to my apartment, and stepped inside. The space looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning, but somehow felt different. Like I was different now, like something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through the world. I hung up my suit carefully, changed into comfortable clothes, made tea. Then I sat on my couch and pulled out my phone. I opened the text thread with my father, looked at his message from weeks ago, and finally, after all this time, I typed a response. "Thank you for saying that. It means something. We have a lot to work through, but I'm willing to try if you are." I hit send before I could overthink it. His response came almost immediately, like he'd been waiting with his phone in his hand. "I am. Whatever it takes. I love you, Jenna." I stared at those words, feeling something old and hard finally begin to soften. Love wasn't enough by itself. Love hadn't stopped him from hurting me, hadn't made him ask the questions he should have asked. But maybe love plus effort plus time plus genuine change could add up to something. Maybe we could build something new from the wreckage of what had been broken. Maybe forgiveness was possible, not all at once but gradually, carefully, honestly. I set my phone down and looked around my small apartment, at the life I'd built in the margins, at the ordinary simple space that was mine. Tomorrow the press coverage would start. Articles about the ceremony, about the cases I'd worked, about the environmental crimes we'd helped prosecute. My name would be public, attached to work I'd done in silence. People in Cedar Springs would read about it. Old colleagues would read about it. Everyone would suddenly understand what I'd been doing for 8 years. But tonight, before all of that, I just sat in my quiet apartment and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The vindication. The recognition. The painful, necessary conversations with my family. The ceremony that had made everything real and public and finished. The beginning of whatever came next. I'd spent 8 years being invisible, being misunderstood, being judged by people who didn't know the truth. I'd let them think the worst because the work mattered more than my reputation. I'd carried the burden of silence because someone had to, and I'd been asked and I'd said yes. And now the silence was over. Now I could be seen again, fully and honestly, without covers or secrets or lies of omission. Now I could walk through the world as myself, Jenna Merrick, environmental crime investigator, federal operative, someone who'd sacrificed everything and done work that mattered. The future was uncertain. I didn't know what job I'd take next. Didn't know if my family relationships would heal or remain fractured. Didn't know what it would feel like to live a life that wasn't built on secrecy. But I knew I'd survived the hardest part. I'd carried the weight and I hadn't broken. I'd let people think I'd failed while succeeding in ways they couldn't see. I'd done right by the work, by the communities I'd protected, by the principles I believed in. And that had to be enough. Would always be enough regardless of what came next. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and stood at the window one last time looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new versions of myself to figure out. But tonight I just let myself be. Jenna Merrick, 32 years old, environmental crime investigator. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's aunt. Someone who'd done hard things and survived them. Someone who'd been invisible and was now finally, gloriously, impossibly visible again. Someone who'd earned her place in the light. The morning after the ceremony, I woke to my phone buzzing with notifications. News articles, social media mentions, emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. The story had picked up more traction than I'd anticipated. Not national news exactly, but regional coverage that was spreading. Oregon woman honored for undercover environmental work, read one headline. Secret operative spent 8 years tracking pollution crimes, read another. There were photos from the ceremony, images of me shaking the governor's hand, accepting the commendation, standing at attention in my navy suit looking more official than I'd felt in years. I scrolled through them slowly, coffee in hand, trying to reconcile the person in those photos with how I saw myself. She looked confident, composed, like someone who'd always known exactly what she was doing. The reality had been messier than that. Years of doubt and exhaustion and wondering if any of it mattered. Years of missing birthdays and holidays and normal life milestones because the work demanded it. Years of loneliness so profound it became background noise, just another thing I carried without thinking about it. But the photos didn't show any of that. They showed the polished version, the public face, the narrative that made sense to people who'd never had to live in the gaps between who they were and who they pretended to be. One article included quotes from Director Hammond. About my work. Miss Merrick demonstrated extraordinary dedication and professional excellence throughout her tenure with the task force. Her investigations were instrumental in 17 major prosecutions across 6 states, resulting in significant environmental protections for communities that would otherwise have been at risk. She represents the highest standard of public service. Reading his words in print felt strange, like hearing someone describe a person I used to be rather than still was. Another article had reached out to the governor's office for comment and received a statement from Chief of Staff Callaway. Governor Thornton has profound respect and gratitude for Miss Merrick's service. The work she did, often at great personal cost, exemplifies the kind of quiet courage that keeps our communities safe. We're honored to recognize her contributions. There was also a quote from someone at the Washington State Environmental Agency, my old employer, diplomatically acknowledging that my departure had been more complex than initially understood, and expressing pride in my subsequent achievements. I wondered how many people there were scrambling to rewrite their memories of me, to pretend they'd never believed the scandal, to claim they'd always known there was more to the story. Human nature, I supposed. Easier to revise history than admit you'd been wrong. My phone rang while I was reading. A number I didn't recognize with the Seattle area code. I answered cautiously. Miss Merrick? This is David Chun from the Seattle Times. I'm working on a feature about your career, and I was hoping you might have time for an interview. We'd love to hear your perspective on the work you did, the sacrifices involved, what it was like operating undercover for so long. I sipped my coffee, considering. Part of me wanted to say no, to maintain the privacy I'd guarded so carefully for 8 years. But I remembered what Chief of Staff Callaway had said about my story matching to other people. About showing that this kind of work existed, that people made these choices, that public service sometimes required real sacrifice. I can give you 30 minutes, I said finally. But there are still operational details I can't discuss. And I'd prefer to focus on the work itself rather than personal drama. He agreed enthusiastically, and we scheduled a phone interview for later that week. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, wondering if I was making a mistake. Wondering if opening up about the experience would help or hurt, whether talking about it would bring closure or just invite more questions I couldn't answer. Another call came through, this time from a number I recognized. Kyle. I answered. Hey. His voice was animated in a way I rarely heard from him. Jenna, have you seen the coverage? It's everywhere. My firm's managing partner called me this morning to say he saw the story, and how proud the firm is to be associated with your family. People at Vanessa's agency are talking about it. This is incredible. I heard the excitement in his voice, but also something that made me uneasy. Pride, yes, but also a kind of reflected glory, like my recognition had somehow elevated him by association. It's just a few regional articles, I said carefully. It'll die down in a couple days. He laughed. Are you kidding? The story has legs. People love this stuff, the secret operative angle. The family that didn't know, the dramatic reveal. Vanessa thinks you could probably write a book if you wanted to. Get a publishing deal, maybe even option it for film. I felt something tighten in my chest. I'm not interested in any of that. This isn't entertainment, Kyle. It was my life. It was 8 years of actual work that actually mattered, not a movie plot. He backtracked quickly. No, of course, I didn't mean to make it sound trivial. I just meant people are interested, that's all. And you should, I don't know, capitalize on that interest maybe? You've earned the right to benefit from your story. I closed my eyes, trying to find patience. I don't want to capitalize on it. I want to figure out what comes next without turning the last 8 years into a commodity. There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice was more subdued. You're right. I'm sorry. I got caught up in the excitement and forgot this is actually your life we're talking about. That was insensitive. I appreciated the apology, but it highlighted something I was already starting to realize. My family's newfound pride in me felt complicated. Yes, they were genuinely sorry for how they treated me. Yes, they were genuinely impressed by what I'd done. But there was also an element of enjoying the association, of being able to point to me now as proof of something good about themselves. Look at what a Merrick can accomplish. Look at the courage in our family. As if my achievements somehow absolved them of the years they'd spent making me feel like a failure. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation strained now, before making excuses to hang up. I sat with the discomfort, trying to sort through what I was feeling. I'd wanted vindication and I'd gotten it. I'd wanted my family to understand what I'd sacrificed, and now they did. But the reality of that understanding was more complicated than I'd anticipated. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't undo the years of judgment. And it came with new complications, new ways they could misunderstand or misuse what I'd done. My mother called mid-morning, her voice bright and determined. Jenna, I've been thinking. We should have a proper celebration. A dinner, just family, where we can all sit down together and really talk. Really hear about what you went through. I want to cook your favorite meal, have everyone there, make it special. I walked to the window, looking out at the street below where normal life was happening. People going to work, walking dogs, carrying groceries. I appreciate the thought, Mom, but I'm not ready for that yet. It's too soon. Too much. She was quiet for a moment. Is it because you're still angry with us? As I understand if you are. We deserve your anger. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. It's not about anger exactly. It's about needing space to figure out who I am now that I'm not carrying all those secrets. And I can't do that while also managing everyone's feelings about what they just learned. Does that make sense? She sighed softly. It does. I don't like it, but it does. I just want to fix things, sweetheart. I want us to be a real family again. The phrase caught me. We were never not a real family, Mom. We were just a family with problems. A family where people made assumptions instead of asking questions. That doesn't stop being true just because now you know what I was really doing. Her voice trembled. So what do we do? How do we move forward? I thought about it, trying to find words for something I was still figuring out myself. I think we move forward slowly. We have conversations, real ones, where everyone actually listens instead of just waiting to talk. We acknowledge what happened instead of trying to skip past it to the reconciliation part. And we accept that some things might not go back to how they were, because maybe how they were wasn't actually that good. She absorbed that, and when she spoke again there was something different in her tone. Something more genuine, less desperate to fix things immediately. Okay. Slow. Real conversations. Acknowledging what happened. I can do that. We can do that. We talked a bit longer, the conversation easier once we'd established those boundaries. She told me my father was reading every article about me, printing them out and keeping them in a folder. That Kyle had apparently spent hours last night researching environmental law, because he wanted to understand my work better. That Bridget's kids had drawn pictures of me as a superhero, and hung them on their refrigerator. Small gestures, imperfect but sincere. Evidence that they were trying, even if they didn't quite know how yet. After we hung up, I forced myself to do normal things. Went for a run through the neighborhood, pushing my body hard enough that I couldn't think about anything except breathing and pace. Showered, dressed, went to the grocery store where I ran into my downstairs neighbor who'd apparently seen the news coverage. I had no idea, she said, eyes wide. I thought you worked in parks or something. This is incredible. You're like a real-life spy. I smiled politely, deflected her questions, and finished my shopping quickly. This was going to be my life now, I realized. Being recognized, being asked about it, having to navigate other people's excitement and curiosity about something that had been deeply private and difficult. The interview with David Chun from the Seattle Times happened 3 days later. I prepared for it, thought through what I wanted to say and what I needed to keep private. He was professional, asking thoughtful questions about the nature of undercover environmental work, the challenges of maintaining cover, the personal cost of the job. "What was the hardest part?" he asked at one point. I considered the question carefully. The isolation. Not just physical isolation, though there was plenty of that, but the isolation of knowing things you can't share, of having experiences you can't talk about, of watching people make judgments about you based on incomplete information, and not being able to correct them. That kind of isolation gets into your bones after a while. It changes how you relate to people, how you see yourself. He followed up. "And your family? They didn't know what you were really doing all those years. What was that like?" I chose my words carefully. It was necessary. The work required complete secrecy and I understood that going in. But yes, it was hard. Being treated like I'd failed when I was actually succeeding, being left out of family events or included only out of obligation, feeling like I'd become someone they were ashamed of. That took a toll. But I'd make the same choice again because the work mattered more than my comfort or my reputation. He asked about specific cases I could discuss, about the training involved, about what came next for me. I answered what I could, deflected what I couldn't, and by the end of the 30 minutes I felt drained but satisfied that I'd represented the work honestly without sensationalizing it. The article came out a week later, featured in the Sunday edition with a photo of me from the ceremony. The headline read, "The Weight of Silence. Inside one woman's 8-year environmental crime investigation." It was fair, thoughtful, focused appropriately on the work rather than the family drama. Chun had included context about environmental crime prosecutions, statistics about illegal dumping and corporate pollution, information about the task force I'd worked with. He'd made it bigger than just my story, connected it to systemic issues and ongoing challenges. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Director Hammond with a simple note. "Hope this represents the work appropriately." His response came quickly. "It does. Well done." My phone exploded again after the article published. More interview requests, more messages from old colleagues, more expressions of surprise and support from people who'd known me before. But also something unexpected. Messages from strangers. Young people mostly saying the article had inspired them, asking how to get into environmental protection work, sharing their own stories of feeling called to public service but worried about the sacrifices involved. I read through them slowly, moved by the earnestness and vulnerability. One message in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman named Kira who said she'd left a job with an environmental nonprofit after facing harassment and threats from the industry she was investigating. She'd felt like a failure, like she'd given up, like she'd let everyone down. "Reading about your work," she wrote, "about the years you spent being misunderstood while doing something that mattered, it helped me see my experience differently. I didn't fail. I made a choice to protect myself so I could fight another day in another way. Thank you for showing that there are different kinds of courage and different ways to serve." I wrote back to her, something I didn't do for most of the messages. "You're exactly right. Protecting yourself so you can continue the work in sustainable ways is just as important as dramatic sacrifice. We need people who can go the distance, and that means knowing when to step back, regroup, and find a different approach. Your work mattered. Keep going." Her response came within minutes, a simple thank you. I needed to hear that. These exchanges, these small moments of connection with people who understood the weight of this kind of work, meant more to me than any of the official recognition. They reminded me why the ceremony had been important, why telling my story publicly served a purpose beyond personal vindication. There were other people carrying similar burdens, other people making similar sacrifices, and knowing they weren't alone mattered. September faded into October. The media attention gradually died down as other stories took precedence. My family and I fell into a new pattern, tentative but functional. Weekly phone calls with my mother where we talked about real things instead of surface pleasantries. Occasional lunch meetings with Kyle where he asked genuine questions about my work, and I asked about his life. Video calls with Bridget's kids where Nathan showed me books about environmental science he was reading, and Lily told me about a school project on water conservation. My father and I exchanged texts, brief but regular, slowly building something that looked less like the relationship we'd had and more like the relationship we could have. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still conversations where old patterns emerged and had to be consciously redirected. Still times when I felt my family was more interested in the story of what I'd done than in the reality of who I was. But there was also genuine effort, real change, honest attempts to do better. I started looking seriously at what came next professionally. Director Hammond offered me a permanent position with the task force, this time above board with an official title and salary that reflected the work. "We need people with your experience," he said during a call. "People who understand how to build these cases, who can train the next generation of operatives, who can bridge the gap between field work and prosecution." It was tempting. The work was meaningful, the people were competent, and I already understood the culture and demands. But part of me wondered if I needed something different. Something that allowed me to use my experience in new ways, to have a life that wasn't defined entirely by secrecy and sacrifice. I also got contacted by several environmental nonprofits interested in hiring someone with my background. One in particular caught my attention, an organization focused on corporate accountability for pollution and environmental damage. They wanted someone to build out their investigative capacity, to develop methods for tracking and documenting environmental crimes that could support both legal action and public awareness campaigns. The work would be challenging but above board. I'd have a team, resources, the ability to speak publicly about what we were doing. It was appealing in ways I hadn't expected, the idea of doing similar work but in the light instead of the shadows. I scheduled interviews with both options, giving myself time to really consider what I wanted. What kind of life I wanted to build now that I had the freedom to choose. In late October, I drove back to Cedar Springs for the first time since the reunion. My mother had asked tentatively if I'd come for Sunday dinner. Just immediate family, she promised. No extended relatives, no big production, just a meal together. I'd said yes, partly because I was ready and partly because avoiding them forever wasn't sustainable if we were going to try to rebuild relationships. The drive was familiar, the landscape unchanged. Small towns giving way to smaller towns, farmland stretching to tree-covered hills, the particular quality of light that belonged to this part of Oregon. I pulled up to my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in, and sat in the car for a moment gathering myself. My father came out before I'd even turned off the engine. He walked to the driver's side and stood there awkwardly until I got out. We looked at each other. This man who'd raised me and disappointed me, and was now trying to find his way back to being my father. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." I nodded. "No. But I'm here." He gestured toward the house. "Your mother's been cooking all day. Made all your favorites. She's nervous." That made me smile slightly. "So am I." We walked to the house together, not touching but side by side, and for the first time in years it didn't feel wrong. Just tentative. Just careful. Just possible. Dinner was exactly what my mother had promised. Small, quiet, focused on actual conversation rather than performance. We talked about my work, about their lives, about memories from before everything got complicated. Kyle asked intelligent questions about environmental law. Bridget shared stories about her kids that were genuinely funny, rather than just proud parent boasting. My mother told me about a book club she joined, and how reading fiction was helping her understand people better. My father mostly listened, occasionally contributing a comment or question, clearly working hard to be present in a way he hadn't been for years. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward pauses, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, times when I felt my guard go up automatically. But it was real. It was honest. It was a beginning. After dinner, my father asked if I'd take a walk with him. We wandered through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, past houses I'd played in front of as a kid, past the elementary school where I'd learned to read. He didn't speak for several blocks, just walked with his hands in his pockets, and I let him take his time. Finally he said, "I've been thinking a lot about that day at the reunion. About what I said." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I meant it as a joke. Not a mean joke, but one of those things you say because everyone's had a few drinks and you're feeling philosophical. I didn't realize how cruel it was until the governor showed up and I saw your face. Saw that you weren't surprised by what I'd said. That you'd heard that kind of thing from me before. That you'd learned to expect it." He stopped walking, turned to face me. That gutted me, Jenna. Realizing I'd made you believe I was disappointed in you when the truth was you'd been doing something extraordinary. Something I couldn't have imagined doing myself. I met his eyes. You made me feel like I'd failed for 8 years. Not just at the reunion. Every time I came home. Every phone call. Every holiday. You made it clear you thought I'd thrown my life away, and you were ashamed of me. His face crumpled. I know. God, I know. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. I will carry the weight of knowing I hurt my daughter, the daughter who was out there protecting people, because I was too proud or too stubborn or too stupid to just ask her what was really going on. Tears were running down his face now, and seeing him cry broke something open in me. He wasn't trying to justify himself. Wasn't making excuses. Was just sitting with the full weight of what he'd done and letting it hurt. I don't know if you can forgive me, he continued. I don't know if I deserve it. But I want you to know I see you now. I see what you did and who you are, and I am in awe of you. You're stronger than I'll ever be. Braver. Better. And I'm sorry it took the governor showing up to make me realize that. I should have known all along. I felt my own tears coming, years of hurt and anger and longing all mixed together. I needed you to believe in me. I needed my father to trust that I knew what I was doing, even if he didn't understand it. And you didn't. You gave up on me. He nodded, accepting that. I did. And that failure is mine to carry. But if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time I have left showing you that I believe in you now. That I trust you. That I see you for who you really are. We stood there on the sidewalk in the fading October light, both of us crying, both of us carrying years of accumulated hurt. And then slowly I reached out and hugged him. He held on tight, shaking with sobs, and I let myself cry into his shoulder the way I hadn't since I was a child. It didn't fix everything. Didn't erase the past. But it was something. It was a step toward forgiveness, toward rebuilding, toward maybe someday having the kind of relationship I'd always wanted with him. We walked back to the house in silence, both of us emotionally wrung out. My mother took one look at our faces and pulled me into a hug without asking questions. Kyle and Bridget were getting ready to leave, gathering coats and car keys, but they paused when they saw us. You okay? Kyle asked. I nodded. Yeah, I think maybe I am. I drove back to Portland that night feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight of my father's disappointment, something I'd carried for so long I'd stopped noticing it, had shifted. Not disappeared entirely, it would take time for that, but loosened enough that I could breathe differently. Could imagine a future where family meant support instead of judgment, where coming home felt safe instead of fraught. In November I made my decision about work. I accepted the position with the nonprofit, attracted by the idea of doing similar work, but in a context where I could build a team, develop long-term strategies, and operate transparently. Director Hammond understood. You've earned the right to work in the light, he said when I called to decline his offer. Go build something good. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I started the new job in December, throwing myself into the work of building out their investigative program, hiring staff, developing protocols, establishing relationships with legal teams and journalists who could amplify the findings. It was challenging and exhausting and deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't experienced before. I had colleagues I could talk to openly about the work. I had a title I could put on business cards. I had a career I could explain to people without lying or deflecting. Christmas that year was different than any I'd had in the past decade. I went home to Cedar Springs and it felt like actually coming home rather than visiting a place I used to belong. We had dinner, exchanged gifts, talked and laughed without the undercurrent of judgment that had poisoned previous gatherings. Nathan gave me a card he'd made himself, construction paper decorated with drawings of trees and rivers and a stick figure he identified as me wearing a cape. Because you're a superhero who protects nature, he explained seriously. I hugged him tight, overwhelmed by his simple understanding of something that had taken his adult relatives years to grasp. My father gave me a gift that made me cry. The folder he'd been keeping, filled with every article about me, every mention of my work, everything he'd been collecting since the ceremony. I wanted you to have these, he said quietly. So you know I've been paying attention. So you know I'm proud every single day. As the year drew to a close, I found myself thinking about trajectory, About how lives can pivot on single moments or accumulate change so gradually you don't notice until suddenly everything is different. 8 years ago I'd made a choice that had cost me almost everything visible while gaining me something harder to quantify. Purpose. Integrity. The knowledge that I'd done work that mattered even when no one could see it. Now I was making different choices, building a different life. One where I didn't have to hide or sacrifice or carry secrets that isolated me from everyone I loved. I was learning to be visible again, to accept recognition, to build relationships based on honesty rather than cover stories. It was harder than I'd expected, reintegrating into normal life after years of operating in shadows. But it was also deeply good, deeply right, exactly what I needed. On New Year's Eve I stood at my apartment window watching fireworks bloom over the city, thinking about the year that had passed and the one ahead. Thinking about family and forgiveness and the long, slow work of rebuilding trust. Thinking about my new job, the team I was building, the investigations we'd launch in the coming months. Thinking about all the versions of myself I'd been, the intelligence analyst who'd started with such optimism, the operative who'd learned to live with secrets, the woman who'd stood in front of her family and let herself be seen. All of them were still part of me, layered and complicated and real. My phone buzzed with messages as midnight approached. Happy New Year texts from my mother, from Kyle, from Bridget. A message from my father that just said, "Proud of you always." A text from Director Hammond that read, "Here's to new beginnings. You've earned them." Messages from colleagues at the nonprofit, from friends I was slowly allowing myself to make, from Agent Torres who sent a simple cheers to visibility. The fireworks reached their crescendo, bright explosions of color against the dark sky. And I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. Not hope that everything would be perfect or that the past could be erased, but hope that the future could be different. That I could build a life that honored both who I'd been and who I was becoming. That I could do meaningful work while also having meaningful relationships. That I could be seen and known and still be safe. That the weight of silence I'd carried for so long could transform into something else. Not a burden but a foundation. Not a barrier but a bridge. I raised my glass of champagne to the window, to the city spread out below, to the year ahead and all its unknown possibilities, to the work that awaited, to the family I was slowly reclaiming, to the version of myself I was learning to be, no longer invisible, no longer carrying secrets alone, no longer measured by others' narrow definitions of success. Just Jenna Merrick, complicated and flawed and real. Someone who'd done hard things and survived them. Someone who'd earned the right to step into the light. The fireworks faded and the city settled into the quiet that comes after celebration. I finished my champagne, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new versions of the ongoing work of living honestly and building the kind of life I wanted rather than the one circumstances had forced on me. But tonight I just let myself rest. Let myself feel the satisfaction of having survived something most people couldn't imagine. Let myself be proud of the woman I'd become, shaped by silence and secrecy but not defined by them. Let myself believe that the best was still ahead, that redemption was possible, that families could heal and trust could be rebuilt and lives could change in ways that felt like coming home to yourself. I fell asleep to the sound of the city outside my window, no longer running from anything, no longer hiding from anyone, finally, mercifully, completely myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.